The different ways to create components. In this video, we'll create an empty component, a component with a feature, convert a body to a component, and we'll use drag and drop to restructure the browser. In Fusion 360, we want to open the supplied dataset Gear Reduction Housing Assembly. This is very similar to the design we began working with, just has a few more details. You'll note that in the Bodies folder, we still have the back housing, the front housing, and the front cover. However, if we take a look inside, you'll note that there are some more details, such as some small recesses that will be used for shafts to hold the gears in place. What we want to explore now is the different ways that we can make components and why components are important to us in the design process. The first way to make a component is to start with an empty component. So I'm going to begin by going to the Assemble menu and selecting New Component. In this case, the type will be Standard, and I'm going to set the component name to be Housing. Note that we have a checkbox here from Bodies, and we can select the parent. In this case, it's going to be the top level of our design, which is automatically selected. We're going to say OK, and note that the housing is automatically active, and then every other thing in the design, bodies, and components included will change opacity. So that way it helps us identify what we're actually working on. Whenever we create a new empty component, every new sketch or feature we create will be included inside of that component when active. And when we go back to the top level, it'll be included in the major list there as well. Another way that we can make components is to create them during a feature creation. For example, if we use Extrude, and we select some of the sketch profiles that are in this design, we'll move our way around, making sure that we grab all the profiles that are of interest, and we'll move all the way down to the bottom section here. Once we have all those, if we begin dragging this out, in this case we'll go 5 millimeters, we can change the operation type from New Body to New Component. When we say OK, a new component is created with the creation of that geometry. Note that it's automatically Component 2, but we can select it and click on it again to rename it. In this case, we'll call this our housing mount. The housing mount created in this way is not active by default. We can activate it, which changes the opacity of everything else, and you'll notice the timeline only shows that extrude. The sketch that was used was created at the top level of the design, so it's not included inside of the housing mount when we activate it. But the housing mount component can be expanded, and it contains its own origin as well as its own bodies folder. If we were to create any new features or components inside of here, they would be created and included inside of that housing. If we want to make any adjustments, we can activate that component and we can modify its features. In this case, I want to add these small sections that I omitted and then select OK. If I want to add things like a fillet to these sharp corners, I can select them, add the fillets. If we need to add additional edges, we can hold down the Control or Command key. We'll say OK, and note that the fillet command is now inside of the timeline. If we activate the top level, it's still in here as an extrude and a fillet, but it's underneath that component. Let's minimize the housing mount and let's talk about another way that we can create components. For this example, I'm going to hide the housing mount and focus my attention on the back, front, and front cover. I'm going to select all three of them, right-click, and select the option to create components from bodies. When I do this, it creates a component for the back housing, the front cover, and the front housing. One thing that's important to note is converting bodies to components means that when I activate these, the only thing we're going to see inside of the timeline is that conversion. Any new features, sketches, or anything that's added to these components at this point will begin to populate the timeline underneath this component. But when we convert them, we're only going to see that top level. There are some other things that we can do with components to simplify the assembly workflow. The back housing, the front cover, and the front housing are all part of our housing, which is currently an empty component. I can select these components and I can simply drag them into that housing component, which makes it a multi-component. You'll notice the icon changes, and these are all still individual components. They're just now nested inside of a top level. This is helpful when we get to the drawing level or the animation level because nested components or subcomponents can be a helpful distinction when we're talking about isolating certain elements of a design. Each of these has their own origin, which means they're free to move about inside of our design. That's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later, and when we create our assembly, we'll be adding joints and rigid groups. For now, if you move any of the components, simply revert their position back to their original location. And at this point, let's make sure that we save the design before moving on.